Everything changed when Tony Curtis returned home in 1955 and discovered a letter. It came from a different man to Janet Leigh, his wife. Their yelling altercation was so loud that night that the neighbors could hear it. Tony never again trusted her. Tony began sleeping with other women behind Janet's back as she denied the affair. Includes a female 17-year-old. By the time of their divorce, the ideal Hollywood couple was concealing startling secrets, private investigators, phone taps, and a jealous rage that permanently ruined their family. For 60 years, they attempted to conceal this shocking tale. In Merced, California, on July 6, 1927, Janet Leigh was born Jeanette Helen Morrison. She was raised in a family that was struggling financially during the Great Depression and was the only kid. Her father kept them afloat by working in factories and taking on odd jobs. Janet spent the majority of her early years in Stockton, where they had relocated shortly after her birth. Despite her family's lack of wealth, Janet was unique. She was a modest, reserved child with extraordinary intelligence. She completed high school at the age of 16 after skipping grades. She frequently escaped into the dark of the theater to lose herself in a movie as her family battled with everyday issues. Something that occurred in 1946 permanently altered her life. In order to help pay the bills, Janet's parents worked at a Sierra Nevada ski resort while she studied psychology and music at the College of the Pacific. One day, Norma Shearer, a former Hollywood star, noticed a picture of Janet hanging in the resort lobby. Even though her dad had snapped a modest Christmas photo, Shearer couldn't keep her eyes off it. She showed the picture to the top talent representative at MGM when she returned to Hollywood. The path to stardom suddenly opened up. Janet was a first-time actor. She did, however, take a screen test from MGM. A contract with one of the world's largest studios was soon in her possession. Shortly after graduating from college and beginning acting classes, she made her radio debut. The first movie she made was in 1947. It had all happened so quickly that it seemed like a dream. However, Janet's personal life was already problematic before her notoriety. She married John Kenneth Carlyle, who was 18, when she was barely 14 years old. It was over in 5 months. A few years later, she married Stanley Reams, a member of the Navy, when she was still a college student. And that marriage didn't last. She ended both relationships prior to her 21st birthday. Only in 1951, when she wed actor Tony Curtis, did she discover love in a way that the world could witness. Between them, they had 2 daughters. The future actress Jamie Lee Curtis was among them, although even that well-known marriage ended in divorce. The hard effort Janet put in before Hollywood called was something that people weren't always aware of. It was difficult to go to college. She began at the age of 16, balancing employment and education to support her parents. She spent a lot of time working in department stores during the breaks from school. She continued to work at the campus information desk throughout the semester. She nevertheless made time to participate in student government, join a sorority, and sing in the college choir. She was incredibly gifted. Hardworking, intelligent, and musical. Once she became a movie star, though, she hardly ever received credit for that. Although she didn't attend college for long, it helped to shape who she is now. She gained power, self-control, and a sense of accountability from it. Traits that would enable her to make a lasting impression in Hollywood and endure in a competitive profession. The way Janet Leigh entered Hollywood seemed like something from a movie. It all began in 1946 when actress Norma Shearer happened upon a picture of Janet at the age of 19 at a ski resort where her father was employed. Shearer handed an agent the picture, awestruck by her beauty. Janet was suddenly on her path to stardom in movies. Despite the fact that she had never performed before, MGM contracted her. Her first film was the 1947 romance Rosie Ridge, in which she co-starred with Van Johnson. However, the studio kept altering her name before the filming was even ended. It was Jeanette Reams at first, then Janet Leigh, and finally Jeanette Morrison, which was her true name. That one stayed because Van Johnson ultimately stated that Janet Leigh was his favorite. Although Janet dropped out of college to pursue her acting career, she wasn't prepared to completely abandon her education. She enrolled in USC Night Studies while balancing her time between film sets and literature. She was a small-town girl 1 minute, and then she was an MGM contract star the next. Hollywood was like that in the 1940s. It's quick, dazzling, and full of surprises. By the end of 1948, Janet was already being referred to as the most glamorous girl in Hollywood. She had only made her debut a year earlier. She received a few big roles in 1949. Little Women's Meg March and Robert Mitchum's holiday affair follow. She switched genres with ease. She once portrayed a nun in a somber Cold War drama. The next, she was like angels in the outfield in a baseball movie that made you feel good. Off-screen, she was seen as real and grounded, despite her dazzling appearance. In just 4 years, she had appeared in more than a dozen movies. Critics began to recognize her talent as well, particularly in movies like Act of Violence, despite the studio's efforts to promote her as beautiful, where she displayed her dramatic skills. Around this period, from 1951 to 1954, Janet experimented with something a little different. She and her husband, Tony Curtis, started working with their buddy, Jerry Lewis, to make unofficial home videos. The public was not intended for these, they were private, light-hearted comedic attempts. Janet was able to test timing without the pressure of the studio. Improvisation as well as many character types. She was able to develop creatively in ways she was unable to on set. Later on, she attributed her improved understanding of comedy to those DIY sessions. Her subsequent films with Lewis, such as Living It Up and 3 on a Couch, demonstrated this. Jerry was not just a co-conspirator. He was even present for the wedding of Janet and Tony. However, not every aspect of her early career was happy. Her encounter with Howard Hughes during the jet pilot filming was lengthy and unsettling. While John Wayne was filming the film in 1949, Hughes developed an obsession with Janet behind the scenes. He began following her around, bugging her phone, and even employing private detectives to do it. Once, he made her believe she was going sailing with a pal. As an alternative, Hughes appeared. Personally brought her to the Grand Canyon before taking her out to supper in Las Vegas. She was dating Arthur Lowe Jr. at the time and lived with her parents. But Hughes was unfazed. Assuming Arthur's sister was a covert boyfriend, he once confronted her with a report he had put together from spying on her. For years, the production dragged on, and Hughes insisted on reshoots. Even though the movie was finished in 1953, it wasn't released until 1957, 8 years after it started. After a while, Janet had enough. She hurled a phone at Hughes when he attempted to stop her from working on her next project, and he became so frightened that he fled behind his desk when her father arrived, prepared to protect his daughter. Bernard Schwartz, Tony Curtis's real name, was born in the Bronx in 1925. Because they were unable to pay their rent, his family was so impoverished that they occasionally had to leave their flat in the middle of the night. From the beginning, life was difficult for him because his parents were Jewish immigrants from Hungary. He was placed in an orphanage with his younger brother when he was 10 years old. Their parents just no longer had the money to provide for them. Serious mental health problems plagued his mother. As a child, she abused him, according to Curtis, who later diagnosed her with schizophrenia. And then the worst hit. He lost his younger brother, Julius, to a truck accident. He was forever affected by the loss. His Orthodox Jewish background included wearing long braids as a child, and he was teased for it. He had to be harsh quickly. His survival skills were learned on the streets. He enlisted in the Navy and witnessed the Japanese surrender in Tokyo Bay during World War II. Using the GI Bill, he studied acting in New York after the war. He received training from future celebrities like Harry Belafonte and Walter Matthau. Although he was still rather gruff, he had a certain flair. He was discovered in 1948 by a talent agency. He was the most attractive man in the room, so he stood out, she stated. That was his Hollywood pass. At the age of 23, he arrived with lofty aspirations but no money. His real name did not sit well with the studio. According to them, it sounded too ethnic. They initially considered Jimmy Curtis, then Anthony Curtis, and ultimately settled on Tony Curtis. It sounded nice, and he liked it. But it also marked the beginning of the process of forgetting his origins. The name wasn't all they did. He learned to fence, ride horses, and speak Polish in the studio. The Bronx kid who spoke only Hungarian as a child was being transformed into a movie star. It wasn't love that brought Tony Curtis and Janet Leigh together. They collided with it like they were in a movie. Sparks clicked right away when they first met in 1950 at a press event. Debbie Reynolds, who witnessed it, compared it as fireworks going off in the middle of the day. Tony was a rugged, attractive man with a big ego and blue eyes. Janet was already a gorgeous, untouchable star. However, everything else was irrelevant when Tony saw her. That was all he wanted, her. The romance progressed quickly, and not everyone was overly excited. When he declared his intention to wed her, Tony's studio, Universal International, became alarmed. 3 days were spent attempting to stop him. They also offered him $30,000 to wed Piper Laurie, another actress, purely for publicity. Tony rejected them completely. He refused to comply, calling Piper a really terrible person. Janet eloped with Tony to Greenwich, Connecticut, on June 4, 1951. Jerry Lewis was a witness on their side. It was an audacious step. Tony realized that he was putting everything on the line, including his future and career. Janet, who was more well-known at the time and had been divorced twice, had far more influence in the partnership. Tony continued to climb and prove himself, but he didn't give a damn. He was really committed. Their romance wasn't quick. It was fierce. Tony felt uneasy, envious, and completely enamored with her. Once, he pretended to be Cary Grant and called her to see if she would accept a more well-known suitor. She didn't. Tony was unable to unwind, though. When she went out on dates with other men, he left his house to wait. Despite their relationship, he felt compelled to defend her. There was more trouble. Howard Hughes, the millionaire producer, had developed a Janet obsession. He tapped her phone, paid investigators to follow her, and sent her gifts. Tony feared that Hughes would destroy him or worse. In his autobiography, Tony expressed his concern that Hughes might really have him assassinated. In spite of everything, they remained together. Additionally, their jobs continued after their marriage, despite all difficulties. They were energized by it. According to Tony, no couple ever achieved the same level of prominence as them until Burton and Taylor appeared 10 years later, and they did so in a scandalous manner. Tony and Janet were charming and talented. They had become Hollywood aristocracy by the late 1950s. Kelly and Jamie Lee, their 2 kids, were adored by everyone. Tony was voted the world's favorite movie at the 1958 Golden Globes. On stage, Janet presented him with the award. It was the ideal Hollywood scene. Their relationship was not only personal, it was also professional. They collaborated on 5 films, beginning with Houdini in 1953. It was a significant one. Despite Janet being the more well-known performer, she agreed to help Tony land his first major part. Tony worked with a magician for a month to practice the skills. Janet claimed that in order to avoid the necessity for special effects in the film, they personally learnt the illusions. However, she acknowledged that Tony's ability to escape locks was not really Houdini. Tony's career took a significant leap thanks to the success of the movie. They co-starred in the following films: Who Was That Lady?, The Vikings, The Perfect Furlough, and The Black Shield of Falworth. Their real-life romance was reflected in their on-screen connection. Powerful, fervent, and unforgettable. Janet Leigh entered cinematic history in 1960. People are still troubled by her shower scene from Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, which she starred in. Even though it was only 3 minutes long, it took 7 whole days to shoot. Hitchcock paid close attention to every single detail. The blood was fake. In reality, it was chocolate syrup because black and white made it appear better. Even a different actress screaming in the bathtub was utilized in the trailer to keep the surprise element fresh. He considered every possibility. Not only did that scene frighten viewers, even Janet Leigh was frightened. She claimed that after filming, she stopped taking showers. Decades later, she still left her shower curtain and bathroom door open anytime she needed to take a shower. She never got over her phobia. Her life was altered by the job, nevertheless. She was nominated for an Oscar and received a Golden Globe. She also earned the title of Original Scream Queen. However, she wasn't just another defenseless victim. Leigh gave her strength and depth. And that significantly altered the perception of women in horror movies. She acknowledged years later that although the incident affected her for a long time, she felt fortunate. According to her, an actor is fortunate if they are remembered for just one part. Her scream, became famous. As Janet made horror history, Tony Curtis was undergoing his own metamorphosis. In his early career, he was mostly regarded as a good-looking man. Despite his pleasant performances and light adventure picture roles, he was not taken seriously by critics. That changed in 1957 with The Pleasant Scent of Prosperity. In contrast to the roles he had previously played, he played a brutal press agent. It wasn't received well at first, and audiences weren't prepared for it. However, people eventually recognized it as a masterpiece. It revealed a more sinister and intense side of Curtis. He played an even more difficult part in The Defiant Ones the very next year. He portrayed a jailer who was shackled to another man, who was portrayed by Sidney Poitier. Both were black and white, and the movie made them confront their disparities. It was unadulterated, strong, and well ahead of its time. There were Oscar nominations for both actors. For the first time, two main actors from the same movie were nominated for Best Actor. Curtis's reputation as a mere attractive face was formally over. He had demonstrated his worth. However, some people thought it was hot in 1959, which made Curtis a real Hollywood star. He played three characters instead of simply one in that movie. He was Joe, an escaped musician. He was a woman disguised as Josephine. Junior was a wealthy man who was posing as someone he wasn't. Curtis had a spontaneous suggestion for that final role. He would speak in the voice of Cary Grant. The director advised him to go for it since he loved it. The movie had a lot of crazy scenes, both on and off screen. Someone made the quip that Curtis had a better posterior than Marilyn Monroe during the outfit fittings. In response, Monroe said, "He doesn't have these," while displaying her chest. The movie was groundbreaking, especially for its time. In a way never seen before, it experimented with sexuality, identity, and gender roles. Although some were concerned about it being outlawed, it was a big success. After winning 3 Golden Globes, it was dubbed the funniest American comedy ever produced. It is still regarded as one of the greatest comedies of all time by critics worldwide. The first child of Tony Curtis and Janet Leigh, a baby girl named Kelly, was born in the summer of 1956. They appeared to the outside world to be members of the Hollywood elite. They were both at the height of their abilities. Tony was rising to fame, and Janet was getting big parts. They appeared to be the ideal pair, grinning for photographers and posing for magazines. However, things weren't exactly as they seemed behind the scenes. When Tony returned home from a day of filming in 1955, he discovered a note. He thought it was from the choreographer Bob Fosse, who was then working with Janet. It sounded like a letter of love to Tony. It made no difference if it was or wasn't. His confidence was broken. Tony has always had a slight sense of insecurity. He was from a difficult upbringing. Janet was more sophisticated and well-mannered. The letter was the final straw for him. In their Beverly Hills home, they got into a heated argument. It was even heard by neighbors. The harm was done, even though Janet denied anything had happened with Fosse. Then there was a rift between them. No matter how many daughters they had, it never completely healed. Jamie, Kelly. Tony would acknowledge years later that their marriage began to deteriorate at this point. Tony succumbed to temptation shortly after. He claimed that he was in his prime at 30 and that there were attractive, glitzy, and willing ladies around. And so he began to say yes. In 1955, he started dating Gloria DeHaven, an actress. During World War II, while Tony was still a young sailor, she had once entertained Navy soldiers. He was a movie star now, and they were sharing a bed. For him, it felt like a complete circle. Tony had an accumulation of affairs between 1956 and 1958. He frequently appeared at events hosted by Hugh Hefner at the Playboy Mansion. He and Natalie Wood had a brief but passionate relationship in 1958. Her pregnancy was confirmed. Miscarriage was the result of the pregnancy. Even after being married to his 6th wife for decades, Tony continued to refer to Gloria DeHaven as the love of his life. However, Tony couldn't tolerate the thought of Janet cheating as much as he was. He started to become obsessed, jealous, and paranoid. He kept calling Janet's hotel room while she was on set. At times, he would make over a dozen calls in a single night. In particular, he was obsessed with Frank Sinatra. Despite the fact that there was no evidence, he was certain Janet was having an affair. During the making of Sinatra's film, The Manchurian Candidate, he engaged a private detective to track her down. The investigator did not discover anything. Tony didn't give a damn. He continued to hold on to his beliefs. According to Jamie Lee Curtis, their daughter, their father's envy tainted everything. She stated he accused her of having affairs with delivery men, co-stars, and everyone else while he was cheating. I failed, like many Save the Marriage babies do. Things reached a complete collapse by the early 1960s. Tony was in Argentina at the end of 1961 filming Terra's Bulba. Christine Kaufman co-starred with him. Just 17 years old. The age of Tony was 36. She quickly captured his heart. Their chemistry was evident to Janet when she paid an impromptu visit to the set. She instantly felt ill. Due to Christine's advanced age, the production team made an effort to conceal their relationship. In many jurisdictions, it would have been unlawful. But Tony moved in with Christine once the filming was finished in early 1962. First in Los Angeles, then in Europe. To live together openly in the US, they waited until she became 18. In September 1962, Tony and Janet were divorced again. Janet Leigh married Robert Brandt the day after her divorce from Tony Curtis was finalized. The date was September 15, 1962. Although the timing drew criticism, Janet wasn't seeking drama. She sought tranquility. Not a Hollywood star, Robert was a stockbroker. He was not interested in the limelight. After more than 40 years of marriage, Janet passed away in 2004. This marriage, in contrast to her first, was calm and stable. They lived in seclusion, away from prying eyes. 20 years into their relationship, a star was named after them both on Christmas Day 1982. Their friendship had grown so strong that it was encapsulated in this little beautiful moment. Jamie Lee Curtis, her daughter, once said that Robert brought her up and instilled in her a love of the natural world. After Janet passed away, he remained in their Beverly Hills house until his own passing in 2009. He clung to the life they created without ever trying to steal the show. Tony Curtis took the opposite route. A few months following the divorce, he wed Christine Kaufman, his adolescent co-star from Terra's Bulba. He was 38 years old. Her age was 18. According to him, his marriage to Janet ended long before the documents were exchanged. Despite their brief marriage, he and Christine had 2 daughters. Another victim of drug abuse and adultery, it ended in 1968. A revolving door appeared to characterize the ensuing years. He got married repeatedly. Andrea Savio, Lisa Deutsch, and Leslie Allen. Every partnership produced instability and new children. At the age of 23, his son Nicholas overdosed on heroin and died. In 1998, he got married for the last time to a woman who was 45 years his junior. Regarding the age difference, he made a joke about how he wouldn't be caught dead marrying someone who was old enough to be his wife. The harm was evident despite the laughs. His career was destroyed in addition to the family being split up by the divorce from Janet. Hollywood became icy. As his children sobbed, movie publications featured headlines about him dating a teenager. Robert Wagner and other old pals criticized him. Studios were no longer phoning. By the late 1960s, The Boston Strangler was his only significant part. Smaller movies and TV appearances dominated the next years. He continued to work, although he never again achieved considerable stardom. Behind the glitter, there was chaos, but the public only saw it. Tony acknowledged how sad he was to lose Janet. She no longer felt the same way about him, despite his claims of love. He became envious and accused her of cheating, even with Frank Sinatra, his buddy. In the meantime, he was preoccupied. Included with Marilyn Monroe and possibly Natalie Wood. With them, the harm didn't end. Their children experienced it as well. Later, Jamie Lee Curtis claimed that her upbringing caused her to struggle with love. As she described it, she was born in the midst of the turmoil, a save-the-marriage baby. Despite their flawless appearance in publications, she claimed that her parents detested one another. Following the divorce of her parents, things were chaotic, particularly with her father. Jamie nevertheless made her own way. She got the lead in the horror movie Halloween in 1978, which went on to become an enormous smash. Casting wasn't solely based on skill. Additionally, it was a tribute to her mother, Janet Leigh, who had years before infamously screamed her way through Psycho. Because of this link between the two films, Jamie became known as a new kind of scream queen. Shortly after, Jamie's mother and she shared the screen in The Mist. They had never acted as a group before. Nearly 20 years later, on Halloween, age 20, they repeated the action. There was also a small nod to Psycho in that movie, as Janet drove a car that was identical to the one she used in her iconic moment. Even some of the music from the original film was used on the soundtrack. A difficult upbringing and complex familial relationships did not deter Jamie from remaining grounded. In interviews, she claimed that horror movies gave her all of her opportunities. She also won an Oscar in 2023 for Everything Everywhere at Once, demonstrating that she wasn't merely carrying on her parents' legacy but rather creating something entirely own. Jamie's father, Tony Curtis, fought to be with his daughters as Jamie made her own. When Tony left Janet during a filming, he essentially vanished from their lives. Later on, he acknowledged that he couldn't bear being near anyone, not even his own children. He attributed it to pain, addiction, and a chaotic personal life. Tony felt that Jamie had been betrayed by Janet, who painted him as a self-centered, untrustworthy mess. That was refuted by Janet. However, the harm had already been caused. Kelly, one of his daughters, attempted to live with him, but the relationship ended. As he grew older, Tony started to experience the consequences of all his mistakes. He stated that he desired peace, but only if his daughters were able to let go of the past, just 2 years prior to his passing in 2010. Then, only months before his death, he took the last blow. Tony's will was altered. He made it extremely apparent. Not one of his 5 kids would receive anything. Jill, his 5th wife and 45 years younger than him, inherited everything. During his funeral, Jamie had just comforted others with a heartfelt speech. However, shortly after, her sister Kelly sued, claiming Tony had been coerced into altering his will. Jill sold off their father's belongings without even providing them with mementos, according to Allegra, another sister. Jamie remained silent. She never mentioned the case or the will in public. Nothing came of the case, and Jill kept everything. With hindsight, Tony and Janet handled their split in quite different ways. Janet remained quiet. She soon married a stockbroker and settled into a more sedate existence. To give her children some stability, she even left the limelight. However, Tony was unable to stop talking. Throughout his book and appearances, he attacked Janet, accusing her of being controlling and claiming that their marriage had been more about advancing his career than love. Despite getting married repeatedly, he never appeared to be content. Because the industry had sided with Janet, he said the divorce had a negative impact on his career.